Well, good evening, all, to all who are on the line and all who are participating in this virtual symposium. I'd like to greet you all in the name of our Lord and thank each of you for your participation tonight, even via YouTube, and our panelists who are all present right now. I'd like to turn it over to Brother Michael Terry if he can go ahead and get us kicked off.
All right. Thank you, Pastor Rose. So good day, everyone. I want to welcome you to this Black Lives Matter Symposium presented by the Men's Ministry of New Covenant Baptist Church of Orlando. I am Michael Terry, President of the Men's Ministry. The title of the symposium is Speak Up, Out, Stand Up. It was inspired by scripture which reads,
over here.
I'm gonna make sure that I'm prepared.
speak up for the people who have no voice, for the rights of all the down and out. Speak out for justice. Stand up for the poor and destitute. And that comes from Proverbs 31, verse 8 and 9. As a result of this conference, symposium, we hope to motivate you to educate yourself further about Black Lives Matter so that you can speak up, speak out, stand up. A teacher, a leader, a reformer in your home, your community, your fraternity, your sorority, your organizations, in your work, in your prayers, or wherever you are that Black Lives Matter. Thank you. And again, welcome. Now, Mr. Len Burnett will share an overview of the background and purpose for the Black Lives Matter movement. Mr.
Thank you
Burnett.
very much, Michael, and good evening, everyone. You know, the Black Lives Matter movement started 7 years ago with the shooting death of Trayvon Martin in Central Florida and the acquittal of his killer. It was dedicated to protest the incidents of police brutality on Black people. Since then, the movement has expanded its focus and now includes protests of racism in all American institutions. The movement has identified racism in our institutions as being systemic. This means that racism is ingrained in these institutions and runs deeply and widely throughout. This evening, we will hit on the impact of racism on the health of Black people. However, our primary focus will be on systemic racism in the criminal justice system and reforms needed to root out this problem. You know, the American criminal justice system is made up of law enforcement, the courts, and the correctional institutions, and it is the largest in the world. And though Black people make up only 14% of this population, they are the majority in this system. They are the majority not as policemen, not as lawyers or prosecutors or judges or jurists or administrators or guards or parole officers. They make up the majority as being those out on bail, as prisoners, as parolees, and as ex-offenders. The result of this one-sided system is that 1 out of every 4 Black boys born this decade can expect to go to prison in his lifetime. And Black adults are about 6 times more likely to be incarcerated than white adults. And now you know, so let the reforms begin. And now Kevin Davis Jr. will lead us in prayer. Kevin?
Bow our heads and close your eyes, everyone, please. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for this day. We thank you for life, health, and strength. We thank you for bringing us here today as New Covenant Baptist Church and as a Black people to celebrate you and to also talk about our people. We want to also thank you for all the mighty things you have done to protect us up until this point through COVID. We thank you for protecting us through quarantine and through our summer as young and old people may go out or stay in their homes. We thank you for protecting us out of quarantine. We thank you for protecting us throughout the rest of this year. We want to ask for your continued protection and your continued safety over us through all of it. We thank you for all that you've done for the church. We hope that we're able to see everyone soon and in good health. I hope that we have a good rest of our Zoom class and that I'm able to learn anything possible new that I can from it. And I hope that other people learn new things too. These and many other blessings I ask in your son, Christ Jesus' name I pray. Amen.
Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Kevin. Kevin is one of those, our graduating high school seniors from New Covenant, and a mighty strong prayer. Thanks again, Kevin. And now I have going to introduce and turn it over to Ms. Beverly Neal, who is the president of Orange County chapter of NAACP. She's also a participant in our social justice ministry at New Covenant, and she will introduce our moderator for today. Sister Neal.
Good evening, everyone. And I'm so happy that you wanted to hear about what we need to do for our community. We have tonight with us, I think, one of the best people who can answer your questions, and not only that, but who can give you some insight. I'm just going to tell you a little something about our presenter for tonight. She is my niece, surrogate, but it's Aramis Ayala, and she received a Bachelor's of Arts degree from the University of Michigan and her doctorate from the University of Detroit Mercer School of Law. And she also received a Master's of Science in Criminal Justice from the University of Central Florida. You know, Aramis was sworn into the state attorney's office in January 3rd, 2017, being the first African-American female ever sworn into the position of state attorney in, I would say, almost in the entire South. I think the closest to her was Marilyn Mosby. But we had a historical event on that day. Aramis has come into the office, and being a woman of faith, putting God first, she came in and made reforms that were bold and unappreciative by the people who are in receipt of what she had to offer. I'm very proud that she is still humble and she is still willing to serve her community. And most of all, she is an adorable wife and a loving mother. I couldn't think of anybody that I would choose to be my niece other than Aramis Ayala. So I will present to you tonight Aramis Ayala, who will be our moderator.
Thank you, Auntie. Good evening, everyone. It's always an honor to be here, but sometimes it is even more of an honor to sit and hear those who have diverse views, because when you sit in a position with an aerial view, you often lose sight of the minor details and changes in the details. That's where we really get the change. So I'm honored to be here, and I'm going to introduce the panel members who are going to be talking this evening. They're going to give a short presentation after I introduce each one of them regarding their areas of specialty. So the first person, if you'll just give a wave, is Dr. Richardson Anderson, who was a medical doctor for 36 years, who specialized in emergency room medicine and public health. Welcome, Dr. Anderson.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Next is Len Burnett. Mr. Burnett is a former federal investigator for the United States Department of Labor. Mr. Burnett, give us a wave, please.
Yes. Good evening.
Welcome and glad you're here. Next is Angela Davis. Angela Davis is a law student. She's an entrepreneur, but right now, especially in this time, one of her most important jobs is that of a mother of a Black teenage male. So Angela Davis, give the people a hello and welcome.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Mary Worley is also one of our panel members. She is a former military intelligence officer and retired FBI agent who I look forward to hearing her insights and the information that she has. Ms. Worley, would you give them a wave, please?
Hello, thanks for having me.
Welcome. You've already heard from Ms. Beverly Neal. Ms. Beverly is she's the current president of the Orange County chapter of the NAACP, president of so many other things, and just a leader and rock in this community. Ms. Beverly, are you going to be joining us on the panel? All right, we'll move on to Mr. Al Williams. Mr. Williams is a retired New Jersey police officer, and we're looking at him as a Black police officer, which is in the heat of these conversations that we're having. And I've told a lot of my friends, I think specifically of you, that as Black professionals, so much of our lives have been compartmentalized, right? You know, we have to be different people and throw on different hats. We've mastered the code switching, and I can only imagine the life that you've had to live. And I look forward to hearing your insights on both sides of this area that we're seeking some more truth. So welcome, Mr. Al Williams.
Thank you.
All right, and finally, Lonard Wilson. Mr. Wilson is probably going to have a lot of clients after all of this is over, something that we could all use a lot of help with. He is a mental health counselor for more than 40 years. I can only imagine how few clients he had historically and back in the day. I'm sure there are people lined up because it is not as taboo to recognize that we all need a little help with our mental health. We feed our bodies, we make certain that we're aligned physically, and I appreciate the work that you do and look for your insight, Mr. Lonard Wilson.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. All right, so the way that we're going to do this is each person has already been introduced, and they've already given a little bit, they're going to focus on their expertise and how it relates to Black Lives Matter, how it relates to issues of race, and in their particular area. You know, a lot of times we only talk about we only talk about reform from certain areas, whether it's just the criminal justice system or just voting. It is a much more diverse panel that is going to talk about their areas where they need to highlight, and go right into it. If we can start, let's start with Mr. Burnett. Take some time and talk to us about systemic racism in the criminal justice system as an investigator and what that looks like. I think we're going to talk about, as a police, from the point that a person is stopped all the way till trial. I'm going to turn it over to you right now to give us a little bit of information and insight on your area.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much again. You know, the biggest crime in our criminal justice system is that it is a race-based institution where Blacks are directly targeted and punished in a much more aggressive manner than white people. The question is, are these facts the mistakes of an otherwise good system, or are they evidence that the criminal justice system is working exactly as intended to control millions of Black people? You be the judge as I take you through the steps of the criminal justice system, from police stop to arrest to bail, sentencing, prison terms, and freedom. And as I give you the facts, I want you to be thinking about reforms that are needed to root out the problems in this system. The first fact: Black males are more likely to be pulled over by police than whites. I'm sure you know that. And Blacks more likely to be searched and arrested than whites at traffic stops. You know, in 2015, Walter Scott of Charleston, South Carolina, was shot by a policeman after being stopped for brake light problems. And then another fact: Blacks are disproportionately killed by police during arrest. Those killed are younger than whites. You know the story. In 2014, Eric Gardner in New York City was under arrest for selling illegal cigarettes, died from a chokehold by the arresting officer. And of course, we know the case of George Floyd in Minneapolis, Minnesota this year, under arrest for allegedly passing counterfeit money, died from a police officer kneeling on his neck for over 8 minutes. And of course, recently Rashard Brooks in Atlanta, you know about the Wendy's drive-through incident, while a resisting arrest for DUI, was shot in the back while fleeing from a policeman. Another fact: Blacks and whites abuse drugs and use marijuana at the same rate, but yet Blacks are 4 times more likely to be arrested. In pre-trial, Blacks are disproportionately jailed while awaiting trial. And prosecutors disproportionately file charges carrying mandatory minimum sentences for Blacks. You know, in 1980, it was adopted as a fight against the war on drugs mandatory minimum sentence. This was a mandatory minimum sentence for each specific drug crime. Judges had no decision how long a person would stay in jail. Example: for possession of 28 grams of crack today, you get 5 years. For 280 grams of crack today, you get 10 years. But prior to 2010 and prior to President Barack Obama, 5 grams of crack got you 5 years, and 50 grams of crack got you 10 years. Over the last 50 years, the prison population has gone from 270,000 to over 2 million. And not because of a dramatic increase in crime, because of these mandatory minimum sentences. You know, 80% of prisoners in jail today under mandatory minimum sentences are Black. And is this a weapon against the war on drugs, or is this a weapon against the war on Black people? Blacks are more likely to receive longer prison sentences than whites for the same crime. And trials are rare for Black people, as most plea bargain rather than go to trial under the threat of a longer sentence. You know, studies show that 80% of Blacks are defended by a public defender, and they accept plea bargain, even sometimes they may be innocent because they do not have or do not understand their rights. Blacks are disproportionately receive prison terms rather than community service. 68% of people in state prison for drug abuse are Black. African Americans are sentenced to 19% longer time in federal prison than whites for the same crime. 8 out of 10 African Americans who qualify for jury duty in Houston, Texas, are excluded for serving on death penalty cases. And as ex-offenders, Blacks are less likely to find employment than whites. In summary, because of the double standards of this system, African Americans are more likely than whites to be stopped by police, more likely than whites to be arrested, more likely than whites to be convicted, more likely than whites to serve lengthy prison terms. Behind each of those more likely, they are Black men and women who, because of the injustice in our system, have been robbed of their youth, their hope, their future, and in some cases, their lives. It is time for change. It is time to reform the criminal justice system. Back to you.
Thank you, Mr. Burnett. I really appreciate those insights. We all know that that our system is plagued with systemic racism, and it was built on racism, you know, dated back to the slave patrols, moving into lynching, into mass incarceration. We understand the history within which we're living. So I appreciate those insights. Now, it's important for us also to understand that there are dead bodies, right? Either from being executed, which I won't start that conversation, or from being shot in the streets. But either way, understanding how that works in the medical field is an important thing in this discussion, because we all know that medical treatment can be different in the conversation of race. So I want to and Dr. Richard Anderson in on this part of the conversation as he rocks his white coat, sir, and give us a little bit of information to help us understand race from the context of you with an MD.
Good evening, everybody, and thanks a lot for this opportunity. I want to focus on public health. Public health studies have determined that 20% of good health results from a healthy environment. Now, this includes things such as safe housing, clean water, and clean air. And 50% of good health results from health of personal habits that we conduct each day, such as eating healthy foods, physical exercise, and not smoking cigarettes. Now, systemic racism, we know, has negatively impacted the health of African Americans because of the poverty and segregation that has relegated many Blacks to the most industrialized and dilapidated environments. Old houses often have lead pipes, lead paint, more pests, and poor air circulation. Lead can damage a baby's developing nervous system, causing behavioral issues and decreasing intelligence levels. We've seen how this has affected babies and other young people in Flint, Michigan recently.
Oh, okay.
Pests such as cockroaches cause allergies and an increase in childhood asthma. Poor air circulation makes childhood asthma worse. Low-income communities have a decreased access to healthy food, such as fresh fruits and vegetables, which cost more, and an increased access to unhealthy fast foods, which cost less. The result is more diet-related childhood obesity and later in life diabetes. Now, on a positive note, recently, Sam Acho, a former Chicago Bears football player, tore down an old liquor store and replaced it with a new grocery store on the west side of Chicago to help address this issue. Coping with chronic stress or racism and any stress often contributes to habits such as adult cigarette smoking, which leads to more childhood secondhand smoke exposure and more childhood asthma. Impoverished communities have fewer safe and secure outdoor areas for children to play and reduce stress. Now, this contributes to childhood obesity, and more anxiety. And in the long term, diabetes, high blood pressure, and heart disease earlier in life than those living in more affluent communities. Let's shift to an issue of incarceration, since we'll be discussing more about the criminal justice system. Since a disproportionate number of inmates are Black, as Len has spoken earlier, incarceration exposes more Blacks to infectious diseases during outbreaks such as the coronavirus currently that's occurring. In the late 90s, Florida had 3 times the national average of tuberculosis cases. And in downtown Orlando, there was twice the state average. At that time, incarcerated Black inmates had a higher TB exposure risk factor. These are just a few examples how systemic racism predisposes Blacks to health-related issues. Obviously, we don't have enough time to go through all of these issues. But finally, public health offers solutions. We have the core competency because we know what to do. We have the social strategy. We know how to do it. What we lack is the political will to just do it. By following public health principles and listening to public health leaders, we can solve these issues. And by not following public health mandates, we continue to have mismanagement and preventable illnesses affecting large populations of people, such as what is currently occurring with the coronavirus pandemic. I want to thank you for your time and your attention, and continue to go forth, be well, and be blessed.
Thank you, Dr. Anderson. Just to give you a heads up in preparation for questioning later, what you sparked and I want to touch on later is that lacking of political will. So if we can talk about that, I appreciate that. It's not just a buzz concept, but I think it can get us somewhere if we develop that thought. So if you want to hang on to that for a little bit.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Lonard Wilson, mental health counseling. I want you to give us a little bit of insight so that we can understand how racism, Black Lives Matter, this moment of unrest that is getting attention. You know, earlier today I was asked, you know, how are we feeling in this moment, this new moment? And I'm like, no, for most Black people, this has been a moment since you learned how to talk, walk, and breathe, right? This is a part of life. This is the talk that we get growing up. This is the learning how to drive. So we have literally grown up in concepts of trauma and learn to live with trauma. And we certainly think that that is normal. And we learn it as our coping mechanism is just the way of life. So I'm going to turn it over to you to talk about some of the issues related to mental health that we are currently in, that we have gone through, and that we can expect in the future. So over to you, Mr. Lonard Wilson.
Okay, thank you. Well, what I want to really focus on is systemic racism affects the children. What's happening with racism as a consequence of happening to the children as a consequence of racism. Okay, I'm going to start with say because of today's social media and increased visibility, Black children become intimately familiar with the pervasiveness of racism in our country. Like Mr. Ayala was saying, we grow up with it. It's a part of life. They see it daily. Schools provide a common context for Black youth and a consistent source of individual and systemic experiences of racism for Black youth. They see our churches where we primarily worship the same Father in a segregated manner. They see courthouses where we go for unequal justice. They see hospitals where we may see different forms of treatment offered. They see our neighborhood schools where, for some reason, schools in our neighborhoods never appear to measure up to schools in other neighborhoods. They see the manner in which our neighborhoods and we as individuals are policed and aggressively profiled. Now, there's a researcher named Naya Hurd-Garris who studied something called vicarious racism. Vicarious racism has been found by her to have certain health impacts, some of which are more immediate and measurable, and some are kind of far off. Some involve the immediate ones, like Dr. Anderson was talking about, the likelihood of obesity and substance abuse, while others are more indirect and hurtful. she reported that even when experienced vicariously, racial some type of world is just.
Mr. Wilson, we're losing some of your volume. It's a little bit,
Oh,
we don't have a really good here. It comes in and out.
okay.
And I think you have a lot to contribute to the conversation. So I want to make certain that we're not missing. And it's been that beginning.
Turn it up. Is that better?
Say
No?
it.
You're not saying again, huh?
Yes, actually it is, but I want to make certain it stays better.
Oh, okay. We'll do that. Okay, I think I was at researching. I have heard, yes.
Yeah, what happens, Mr. Wilson, is you begin to talk and it sounds very strong, and then all of a sudden it fades out.
Okay.
Are you close to a microphone?
It's supposed to be a mic on this.
Oh, okay.
I'll tell you what, I'll hook it and see if I come through the.
All right, well, I'm gonna go ahead. What we're gonna do, I'm gonna come back to you. If you can try to see if we can get a better sound.
Okay.
Mute it, we'll go from there. But I wanna keep everyone involved in the conversation as much as we can. Mr. Wilson, I promise to get back to you because I think that mental health obviously is something very important. All right.
All right.
Moving on to Miss Angela Davis. How are you?
I am good.
Good. Thank you for joining us. As Mr. Wilson was talking, he was talking about, the growing up. And I think we often talk about, young Black boys and the trauma that they have, not realizing that moms are also being traumatized by the fear of letting their sons go and leave, or even their friends being stopped, and that vicarious experience that they have that impacts them. In addition to you being a law student and on your way to make some even more broader change, I want to talk to you about both of those. So if you can go ahead and take the floor on your experience as a law student, entrepreneur, and certainly as a Black mother, not just in this time, but where you've been and where you would like to see us headed.
Absolutely. What I'd like to start with as far as where I've been, first explaining that, full disclosure, that I used to believe that as long as you didn't do anything wrong, why would the police stop you, right? I actually used to believe that. Now, fast forward to once I got married, and I've been with my husband now for over 20 years, and I've learned a lot, in that instance. And with my husband and I originally at the onset, even butting heads about the world and how society sees the Black man. And me being in corporate America at the time, I would tell him, look, I worked hard, blah, blah, blah. And if you just did this and so there was a lot of that would happen. And it wasn't until 2002 with the birth of my son that things began to shift for me. And because when my son was born, he's our only one. We raised him in the church. It's always been where I've said, okay, as long as I make sure that he has the right education and we do all these things. The day I got his social security number, signed up for that 529 plan to make sure that, we were on the right track educationally, put him on the wait list for this school that had a 2-year wait list. I wanted him there because I wanted him by the time he was 2 or 3 to already, begin, his educational journey. Then I got the big pause, right? I never even thought about my son having to have the conversation with him that early about being Black until we were on our way home after I picked him up from that same school. That in his class, he was one of 2 Blacks in the school. And he asked me on the car ride home, he said, Mommy, are we Black? Mm. And so my first thought was, okay, don't, have a fit, don't let him see you react. So I said, what happened today? Somebody told you that you were Black? And his good friend, which was a white kid, Nolan, and you would be surprised. See, I still remember that name. It traumatized me so much. Nolan told him that he was Black. So then in my head, I began to think, if I don't teach him who he is, society's going to tell him who he is, right? So then my husband and I started thinking, okay, do we already have to have this conversation with a 3-year-old? and helping him to understand. So it was confusing for him, because then he began to ask, okay, so daddy and I are Black, but you're not Black, right? So there were a lot of questions surrounding that. And then 2 years later at the same school, they had a play, and they were doing all of the leaders, George Washington, Martin Luther King. Well, lo and behold, they only had one Black boy. So who do you think they asked to be Martin Luther King? So my whole thing was, I went up to that school and told them, no, ma'am, he will not be your Martin Luther King. Let one of these white kids who need to know their history, understand who Martin Luther King is. Maybe if they studied Martin Luther King, we wouldn't have these issues, right? So I feel like I became this militant overnight, and it was because of that mother lion thing with my son. So now it's like that he's about to go to college. Just did some orientation work today with that. He's 18 now, but even when he got his restricts, I actually told him a not truth about him not being able to drive right away. So I kept making up reasons why he couldn't get a car, and trying to understand why all of that was happening. And I remember even in our neighborhood, when the Trayvon Martin incident happened, just wanting to keep him sheltered, right? Because in our neighborhood, there wasn't a lot of people of color, and then saying, okay, well, you don't wear that, do this, do that, don't, and so it became where I felt like I was pulling my hair out and becoming more like Mr. Wilson was saying, giving me an anxiety. I don't sleep at night now because he works as an essential worker at Home Depot until he gets home. I tell him, call me when you get in the car, and he's always like, he tries to understand, but I know he feels like, I'm just like hovering sometimes, but I have to know where you are, what you're doing. And of course, we've had to have the 10 and 2 conversation with him. When you're stopped, make sure they see your hands. And one of the things that I've also told him, ask if you can call your parents, so that maybe that'll trigger something in them to realize that you are a child, that you're not an adult. Every time he starts to grow facial hair, I don't know if you guys saw him on camera when he did the prayer, he has little facial hair. And I keep telling him, you need to cut that because you look older, when you have the facial hair. So it's all of these things that we've had to condition ourselves that I didn't feel like I was going to have to do with my child, because, he was going to be educated and he was going to be all of these things, and even me going to law school, I went to law school to further my business, to add, that piece to my business. But since I've been in law school, I've learned more about the Constitution. Now, I know that people will say, I know my rights, I know it's in the Constitution, but now if you ask Angela Davis, which amendment is it, I can tell you. If you ask me, where the stuff is found in the Constitution, I can tell you. And what bothered me was when I started to see things like jury instructions for jurors. And I started to see things, when you go through a court system and the Bates rule, for jurors, and, having a jury of your peers. And I began to think, nothing's going to change here. I can become an attorney litigating in somebody's courtroom, but if I'm still litigating under these regulations, nothing changes, right? So I need to do something legislatively here. Something has to happen there. And we were having a conversation before with the panel. We've got to do legislatively starting on the ground level. So right now for me, I feel like constitutional law might be the better thing where I want to go if I want to protect our children, if I want to protect my grandchildren, in the future. Because there was no way that George Zimmerman was going to be convicted with those jury instructions that jury was given. And so that's kind of where I'm coming from.
All right. Well, thank you. Thank you. I mean, it definitely gives a perspective that is clear, that is not just anecdotal, because I think there's a lot of people who can completely agree with those discussions. I'm going to turn it back to Mr. Wilson. Let's get a mic check, see if we can hear you now.
Okay, am I coming through?
You are coming through, winning. Yes. All right. So
okay. I guess it was the headset. Huh?
Yeah. I'm going to ask you to start over because you have to offer is too valuable to just start where you think you left off. So I'm going to take us back to the beginning.
Okay, I'll start back at the beginning. I said, because of today's social media and increased visibility, Black children are able to become more familiar, more intimately familiar with the pervasiveness of racism in our society. They see it daily. Again, in the schools, they see it, where they're systemically and individually experiencing racism. They see it in our churches, where we worship the same Father segregated. They see it in the courthouse, where we go for unequal justice. They see it in the hospitals, where we may see different forms of treatment offered because of the color of our skin. They see our neighborhood schools, where for some reason, the schools in our neighborhood never seem to measure up to the standards of the school in other neighborhoods. And they see the manner in which our neighborhoods and we as individuals are profiled and aggressively policed. Now, there's a researcher named Naya Hurd-Garris who has studied vicarious racism. And she's found that vicarious racism does lead to health impacts, some of which are immediate and we can measure right away, like substance abuse and obesity, and other effects that are indirect and hurtful, like, for instance, vicarious racism affects and threatens a child's sense of the world as just and fair and safe. And instead fosters feelings of helplessness and despair. And these feelings and this experience and these experiences can have long-term implications and impacts on a person's health. Now, one of the most harmful forms of vicarious racism is racism that's experienced by the parent that's witnessed by the child. And that happened to me, both as a child and as an adult. All of these and other psycho-emotionally hurtful experiences produces prolonged stress in Black children and adults. Recent studies have found an increase of depression, obesity, and greater susceptibility to sickness among children who are exposed to the stress of racism. Researchers have linked racism experienced by children to worsen sleep, higher rates of doctor visits, and lower self-esteem. And we're gonna find lower self-esteem, lack of confidence and feeling bad about yourself, feeling unlovable, feeling incompetent, being awkward in situations, okay? Now, similar to survivors of other types of trauma, we're talking about, whether it's sexual trauma or physical or domestic violence and stuff, children who are exposed to racism often experience fear and hypervigilance, headaches, insomnia, body aches, memory difficulty, self-blame, confusion, shame, and guilt after they have been the victim of a racist experience. One of the main mechanisms responsible for those effects, according to researchers, is the prolonged stress wears on people's body, the way it wears on your body. Experiences of discrimination can flood the body with stress hormones, one of which is cortisol, a chemical that gets the body ready for fight or flight. Studies have shown that even the anticipation of discrimination can produce the stress response centers. And then that cortisol or those other chemicals that are related to the stress response then has a negative impact on our bodies and then can contribute to those chronic health disorders, the diabetes, the heart disease, the hypertension. Now, what do we do? talking to the children about race and racism with a focus on promoting resilience to discrimination can help them feel empowered and hopeful about the future. For Black youth, such conversation can foster strength in the face of discrimination, healthy self-esteem, and self-efficacy, and can promote psychosocial well-being and a positive sense of racial identity, and then a comfortableness with being who they are, with being me. Now, it's probably best when you're speaking with young children to limit their exposure to the graphic media stuff and adult conversations, right? Because talking to children about race and racism with a focus on, talking to children about the graphic stories of media coverage on racial violence and exposure to adult conversation can again trigger that stress response, and they feel anxiety and they feel fear, and they get all of those negative chemicals in their system, which increases again the prolonged stress and the trauma symptoms. When we talk to the children, we'll use language that the children understand. You know, when we talk about fair versus unfair with the small kids, and define terms that, you know, they don't understand, that are unfamiliar. We want to be honest and factual in discussing the individual differences like skin color, hair texture, and color. We want to acknowledge that people are treated differently based on the color of their skin, and that these different standards are unfair. We want to talk about how unfairness and racism is a part of American history and a part of the history of the Black man in America. We want to talk about how the histories of different people differ, and how, whether based upon your race and skin color, the amount, the frequency, the type of discrimination you will experience will be different, as well as the amount, frequency, and type of privilege that you experience, again, based upon skin color. It's important that parents share their own experiences and beliefs about racism with their children. But I want you to know it's equally important to encourage your children to express their opinions and their feelings and ask the questions that's on their mind. Younger children may focus more on how events will affect them and people they love in the present, while older children may be more focused on what's happening in the community, what's happening in the world, and what they can do to contribute. Our Black children are especially likely to show and talk about the distress they feel when they're witnessing or experiencing racism, right? We need to validate those emotions. We need to validate their reactions. We need to let them know that it's okay to feel whatever they're feeling, and what they're feeling is what they're supposed to feel, and that probably other people are feeling the same way. It's essential to find out what the children already know or what they're thinking and correct any misinformation. We as parents can support our children by listening to their experiences and their opinions about racism and helping them think about how they may manage race-related situations and feelings. It's important for Black parents to have the talk. I've heard a couple of people talk about having had the talk. That's great. We need to have the talk with our kids. We need to talk with them about the police. It's important for us to talk to them about the police, and we need to be honest with them from an early age about what's going on and about the potential for the situation to go wrong and the higher potential for it to go wrong when your skin color is dark. We need to highlight that law enforcement officers' job is to keep all people safe, and that it's not acceptable for them to treat people differently because of their race. We need to explain to our children what they can do if they experience or witness racism. And for example, young children can tell a trusted adult, right? Now, given that older children, we're talking about people 12 years and older, have procedural interactions with law enforcement people more frequently. Because they're older, they may see them at school, they may be involved with them and have interactions with them. We need to talk with them a little bit different. We need to give them more information about what their rights are. We need to let them know what's appropriate and not appropriate. And you know, sometimes we might need to go and talk with people about what we can do, how we can navigate these situations.
Mr. Wilson,
Yes.
I'm gonna move on. We got two more people, and I want to make to the questions. And it's my hope that at some point we'll be able to address those things of how we can talk to people during the line of questioning. But I want to get over to Mr. Williams to give us his insight as a police officer, because you linked us straight over, because some of those law enforcement officer encounters are with kids, some of them are with adults, and then some of them are with adults and the kids are watching. So I'm going to turn it over to you, to Mr. Williams, to unmute yourself and go ahead and give us some insight from your perspective, please.
Good afternoon. I joined the police department in 1964, the Newark, New Jersey Police Department. At that time, the population in Newark was majority white, minority black, something like 60-30, and I think the rest was something like Hispanics. In 1967, we had what is called the Newark Riots, and I had been on the job 3 years. And up until that time, when you first come on the job in those days, your primary job would be foot patrol. You would walk foot patrol for like 2 years before you would work your way up to getting into a radio car to do a radio patrol. And when I first came on, I had a training officer, a white guy, a good policeman. But I noticed I remember that night very well, because that was my first night out in the patrol car. And I know we went to a disturbance at a pool room in the white section. And we went up and we saw the other police car there already. So we was like, back up. We got out and they had settled whatever it was, and we went on our way. Excuse me. Sometime later, we had a call for a disturbance in the black neighborhood. And he politely told me, as we started approaching the scene, you need to get your nightstick. Well, in the radio car, you have nightsticks that are put into slots, and and your flashlight. And you're supposed to check that before you leave the precinct. Anyway, when I went to take my nightstick out, I didn't pull it up right. He told me, you got to pull it up, And we got there, and the radio car was there also. And we got out, and I thought to myself, why didn't we get a nightstick when we went to the white disturbance in the white neighborhood? Why was the nightstick necessary in the black neighborhood? Young didn't say nothing about it. And so, things went on. During the riots, there was a lot of shooting by the National Guard, the state police, and the statistic they give for the Newark riots is something like, I think they say there was 26 deaths or something like that. And I say, well, maybe so, but that was a lot of shooting. But leading up to that, when I joined the force, the majority was white. When the riot starts 3 years later, blacks had become the majority of the population, but the police department was still majority white. let me just read this part to you. It said in the early 60s, Newark had a population of around 400,000 people. 65% of the city was white and 19% was Black. In 1967, Blacks made up 65% of the population, and Newark became one of the first major Black cities. That's how fast the population was changing. We had what you call white flight. They're getting out of the city, Blacks are moving in. But the majority of the police department was still white. And that at the time, I think when I came on, it was, we had something, this statistics say 142 Black policemen. I don't think so. I have to dispute that. We didn't have that many. Out of something like 1,200 policemen, I think we might have had 100, 110, but they said 142. But anyway, the Black policeman was not represented to the population of the city. So that was a problem. And the problem became systematic because the Blacks was getting stopped for anything, everything, harassment, brutality. And so when 1967 came around, you could feel it in the air, the tension. And we could tell that something was going to happen. There had been, I think, 2 major riots in 2 other cities before that. And you could see it was going to happen there.
Mr. Williams, I'm going to ask you before I head over to Ms. Worley, if you can touch on the experience as a Black person in uniform at that time, because I think that's like the most important. If you can make a couple points to that so I can get to Ms. Worley, that'll help the conversation and the questions a little bit.
Well, as a Black person, we noticed it right from the precinct, from the start, that your assignment would always be, in a Black neighborhood. Very few times were you assigned, even on the walking post, to a white neighborhood. And as it was, you could see that the racism was in the whole system, because your assignment would be always to something Black, and the other white people assignment would be to to the better neighborhoods and stuff like that. So that you could see it from the start. That was just the basic thing to it. So with that went all of the experience you had with the white officer, when you would ask them, why are you doing this or what you're doing and stuff like that. And that's what basically my experience with that during that time.
Understand. We're going to get back to some of those questions. I really, really appreciate that insight, because I don't think that it's any different today with the assignments, where people are placed. It all has to do with that implication. Ms. Worley, you too have some law enforcement with FBI. Would that be correct?
Yes.
All right. So I want you to talk to us a little bit about that experience and how that relates and connects to this time in which we're living.
Okay. Good evening, everyone. As she stated, I'm a retired FBI agent, but before that, during my career, I served in the Army as a military intelligence officer for 12 years, spending the last 4 years as a captain stationed in Berlin, Germany. Now, after I left the Army, I joined the FBI as a special agent in 1991. And I served for 20 years, achieving the rank of supervisory special agent before I retired. As some of you may or may not know, that women and minorities initially were not allowed to join the FBI as agents under the former director of J. Edgar Hoover. But after he died in 1972, Blacks and other minorities, to include women, were permitted to join the FBI. Years before I entered the FBI, Black within the Bureau were experiencing widespread discrimination. Black agents were being passed over for promotions, although they were qualified more so than their peers. And the number of Black agents that were being hired was very low. At that time, the Bureau had about 10,000 agents nationwide, and only about 500 were Black. And the numbers were even lower for Black female agents. Of the 500, only about 100 were for female Black agents. Now, I recognize this rarity of Black female agents when I was out on a raid, and this was a drug raid, and it was in a Black neighborhood in Washington, D.C. And that day, the kids were out of school. It was summertime, so there were a lot of little Black kids out playing. And so when we pulled up, you know, you have to have on your raid jacket, and it had FBI on the back. And I heard the kids shout, "Look, there's a Black FBI woman," because I was the first one that they had ever seen. And then I knew we were in trouble, basically, as far as the Black females. They hadn't seen anybody that looked like me. So the first time I really recognized that Black female agents were rare was when I went to the academy at FBI headquarters, well, FBI Academy in Quantico, Virginia. I got to the academy, and I'm thinking there are going to be a lot of Black women there, because when I took the exam out of Chicago field office, there were a room full of Black women and Black men. So I'm thinking, you know, we're going to be represented. I get to Quantico. I am the only Black female in the entire academy. Now, during a cycle, you have about 30 to 34 students in each class. And there are about 7 to 8 classes going on at the same time. So there's about 225 students at the academy, and I was the only Black female for about a month. And there had not been one before me for 9 months. So after that, I think the month after, I saw another Black female come in. So it was very bad. Now, both professional staff and experienced, both the professional staff and the FBI agents experienced the same racism and discrimination as well. When Black applicants with college degrees applied for jobs in the Bureau, they brought them in at the lowest pay grade. At the same time, they had white applicants with high school diplomas coming in at a high pay grade. In 1990, I guess we had gotten enough of that, Black FBI agents filed a discriminatory lawsuit against the Bureau. Then the Bureau settled the Black agents lawsuit around 1992 by agreeing to promote and hire more Black agents. Fast forward to 2020, the Black agent numbers have gotten worse. They are hiring fewer Black agents, and there are very few Black in upper management. They continue to give lip service to diversity and inclusion. Unfortunately, the people in charge of promoting or bringing in Black agents are predominantly white, and they have no desire to increase that number. When Black employees complain about racism and discrimination that exists in the Bureau, they circle the wagons and blackball those individuals. During the lawsuit I talked about in 1990, those agents who brought the lawsuit, they did not benefit from it. The FBI is responsible for hate crimes, like the recent one involving Bubba Wallace, the stock car racer. I cannot be sure, but I doubt if there was any Black agents on that case. During my tenure, the Black agents made up 11% of the agent population. Currently, they only make up 4%. If Black professionals are not in the room when decisions are made, racism and discrimination will continue to be prevalent and impact not just our society, but our national security as well. And this is why we must be at the table, or we will surely be on it.
Amen to that. Thank you, Ms. Worley. Concise ending, I appreciate that. What we can do now is, since we've heard from everyone, and I think she led us right into that about being at the table, I think it's important to recognize that we have created a table here this evening. right? And we're ready to talk about some of the changes and reforms that can be implemented. So let's talk. I have a couple of questions before we get to some of the reforms, because first you have to identify the problem, then you have the people who are the problem have to admit to it, then there's got to be some type of reconciliation. Unfortunately, we're still trying to define the problem in some areas, and we got other people trying to admit to it and deny it. But I want to focus for a minute on that place where people are denying it. You know, you hear things like race baiting or, you know, the race card and all of those conversations from non-Black people when you're trying to have a conversation. So I'll toss this out to anybody who wants to answer it. But when we're trying to move toward answers, reforms, and calling out some of the issues, what are some of the ways that we can manage those microaggressions? Well, actually, those are plain aggressions. We'll talk about microaggressions in a minute, but those blatant misstatements that it's just race baiting and like there's a card to play when you're talking about Black lives. So anybody else, anyone want to take that about how we manage that conversation when we're handling it? So when we acknowledge it needs to be handled delicately. I'll open it up, anybody? All right, well, since you just spoke, I'm giving it right back to you, Ms. Worley.
Yeah, okay. I think, you know, it's hard to get through to people who are in denial or don't really want to have that conversation. I was listening to Trevor Noah earlier, and he was talking about the difference in South Africa and in the United States. They have no problem discussing racism and how it happened. Whereas we here in America, we don't want to talk about our history because they feel like that we're accusing them of being the cause of it or blaming them. And we're not trying to look for blame, we're trying to look for solutions. If we can discuss the racism that exists, then we can fix it. But to get to that conversation, it's really, really hard because in their mind, they're saying, you're blaming me. I wasn't there. I didn't cause slavery, or I didn't do this. No, we want to go forward. We want to talk about these things, bring them out so we can fix them.
And that's part of the issue, is that we create this defensive response. And I saw you take it off mute, so I'm going to welcome you in here into this part of the conversation, Mr. Wilson, about how we respond when people are simply being defensive and denying, all defensive and dismissive about very real truths that we have lived.
But when you're dealing with folk like that, you have to understand that, you know, what they're doing is actively, consciously, unconsciously, attempting to avoid accountability. They don't want to talk about it because when they talk about it, they have to be accountable and accept responsibility. If I accept responsibility, I got to make a change. You know, what we have to acknowledge is that this country legacy is founded on racism. That race is something that was created in America. It was created by the colonizers so that they could make a hierarchy. That's what it was created for, so that they could have a hierarchy with them at the top, with the people whose lands they were stealing in there, and the people who they enslaved at the bottom. They did that, so it's in the system, and it's going to be in the system. And we have to talk with them and bring them to see that reality, that fact. Because they, again, what they'll do when you talk with them is they make those statements that minimize the responsibility or the effects of it on us, straight up deny it, or blame us, or blame history, or blame something else for it. All of those are tactics to avoid accountability. What we have to do is continue to talk with them and bring facts to them, to work them through to the place. Now that takes a long time. What we're talking about takes a long time. It was a long time happening. It's going to be a long time straightening it out. We got to change belief system. You know, the fact of the matter is they believe they're better than us. They believe it in the core. Why? Because that's what they were taught, and because how the system is set up, they can look around and see things that they think is evidence.
You know, that brings us to the next portion of like the conversation, because as long as they believe that, and that is a matter of their heart, then how do we get to what Ms. Davis was talking about when it comes to legislation? You can't legislate matters of the heart. So Ms. Davis, you talk about legislation, what are some of the ways that we can overcome real root issues that we may not be able to like cover with just legislation? And I'll give you an example. When we talk about stand your ground, when we talk about police shootings, you know, so many times I've reviewed them and I believe a crime has occurred, but the law doesn't support that a crime has occurred because they're waiting for the subjective interpretation of whether or not they perceived a threat. And if they believe that a person's race is a threat, their physical appearance is a threat, they're always going to be justified in that shooting. So even if we change the language, there's still some level of justification. So I want to ask you a little bit, when you think about legislation, what kind of legislation can really make a difference when some of this is really just matters of the heart and mind?
And even if it is heart and mind, it still goes back to words matter, right? So legislation, when I talk legislation, I'm talking textually, right? And what the words actually say. Mm-hmm. Because there are some words, when you look at them and how they're interpreted, it doesn't matter what the heart thinks, the words say what they say, right? So as you write it, but when we talk about the heart, it goes back to what Brother Wilson was just saying. I think it's about, it's a fear that European people have of something being taken away from them. If I admit accountability in this, that takes away a privilege from me. And in most cases, until something happens to them, this is going to be a hard fight, because until something happens to you, and just like in my opening, when I explained, I really didn't see the plight of the Black man. Although I have a brother, I have a father, I didn't see the plight of the Black man until my son was born. So now it was like the world was happening to him, but I felt like he was a part of me, you know? So it was like all happening there. So if I think about what that means, and if it's a matter of the heart, I'm reminded of that movie, A Time to Kill. And I don't know if you guys saw that, but at the end, when Matthew McConaughey gave his closing statement, and he was describing all of these bad things that these white men had done. They had raped this Black child and beat her and left her broken and for dead. And when he said, "Open your eyes, now imagine that she was white," that's a matter of the heart. He took legislation and how something that was written, but he put it back on, they have to see us as people. And it's been say again, Miss Mary? I'm sorry.
They have to see us as humans, because
right.
They see us less than.
Exactly.
When you see someone less than, then you can treat them any kind of way.
That's a really good point. I want to jump off that, because I think we have internal and in-house business to take care of, right? Because sometimes when we do things in our community, we justify certain things because we see them as less than human. So are we not perpetuating that mindset that a person can actually be dehumanized by their conduct?
Yes, because with the crime going up now with the shootings, and it's in our own neighborhoods, our own people. So to me, you're right. We are dehumanizing our own people by putting less value on their lives, so we can just shoot them and take their lives.
And then in addition, when we see, like, you know, grandma robbed, or when we see, you know, someone, a woman beaten to a pulp by her husband and or boyfriend, we use labels and names like that thug, he's a monster, and we use inhumane things to justify mistreatment. Are those some of the things that could make a difference in how we are perceived if we begin to perceive ourselves different, or do we have to be perceived differently? Which one comes first, the chicken or the egg? I happen to believe it's in the mirror first, but I just want to toss it out to you all for that discussion.
I think it has to happen, you know, on both sides. I don't think that I think that first we do have to see ourselves as humans, because then if we do as well, then we begin to stand up for those things that are right. We stop within ourselves, like you're saying, you know, thinking, well, you know, oh, that thug, they deserve this or they deserve that, when they are just human as well. So yeah, I do believe that it starts from self. It's just like as a little girl, your dad telling you that you are a princess, you believe that, you know, and then every man moving forward needs to also believe it too.
Dr. Anderson, I want to bring you in on this, because in the medical field, whether it's public health or when you were in an ER room, like, they're all human beings, right? They get a birth certificate and they get a death certificate, and they get medical treatment for a human body no matter what. Like, what more can we be doing when medically you're treating human beings?
Well, we were always taught to treat everybody the same. I mean, I've treated people in urban areas, suburban areas, inner city, and I can tell, and rural. And you have the same issues. You have people who have low education sometimes, low self-esteem, and they act out. And also you have people come into the emergency department acting out because they've never been treated well other places. So sometimes you have to separate it and don't take it personally. You have to say, okay, as my uncles say, they're scratching, where's the itch? And once you do that and understand what's the concern they have, now you have a dialogue. And I think that's what it comes down to, having a dialogue, regardless of who the person is. And when they come in emergency, we treat everybody. That was just not a question. I treated people with swastikas. I treated people who called me the N-word. But I also recognize some of my own people were calling other people things too. Because you got people are people. It's just we're not the ones who are in charge at this point. The people are people.
So is there a way to have that mentality, if you will, in the medical field transcend into politics, transcend into, you know, Congress and Senate? Is there a way for us to really allow that to permeate throughout this country?
Well, I was talking to a cousin of mine once. We were talking about how you change a culture in the business world. And basically it starts with human resource. You hire the right people who already have that particular character. That's the same thing. You have to elect people with the character that you want, and then people can be trained to do things. But if you don't have the right person when you hire them, who are already open-minded, it's very difficult to change people. Similar to what was said earlier, until it's personal, often people don't get it. I used to teach people that you teach, yes, you touch the head, you touch the heart with a little emotion, but until you hit their hunger, where's gut, what really reaches them, you don't get through. So you got to find out what's important to them to frame it a certain way. Getting back to public health, that's one of the tools that's used. It's called social marketing.
I like that. I like that. I want to bring in Mr. Burnett and Mr. Williams. You know, Dr. Anderson was talking about, you know, you've got to put people in place who already have the character. I know there were things when I was running for state attorney that I tried to expose my character, because to ask for a perfect state attorney would be asking for something that is unrealistic. But I can have a perfect heart towards the people. I can have a clean character. What are some ways that people can identify and look at candidates to see their character? Because we all see the beautiful signs, the great lingo, the right places, showing up at church. But this is not a good time for people who just live off showing up at Black churches during COVID. So this is not their season. But you know, what are some ways that you can look and things that you can listen for when you're trying to determine whether or not a candidate has the character that is going to fulfill those promises? You're on mute, sir. You're muted. Mr. Burnett, you're muted. Can you take it off?
Oh, okay. I'm not sure about the person's character, but back to one thing you said, changing hearts. I think now that we always walked on eggshells around these people, and I walked on eggshells and talking about racism. We walked on eggshells and we twist and turn, trying to be politically correct. I think now we straight ahead. You're looking at changing policy. You can't change hearts. Martin Luther King couldn't change heart, but he was able to get a civil rights law passed. And so we got to change. We can change, can't change legislation right away, but we can change policies. We can change police policies relative to chokehold, relative to the use of the body camera, relative to the use of training and being transparent about those policemen who have bad conduct. You have a right to know all those policemen who have bad conduct, and you just got to, some kind of way we got to monitor those things. So we have a right to demand training, sensitivity training in Black community, and you have a right to demand more Black officers. These are things you can do at the local level, and these are things that we can do almost immediately. Go to the mayor of the city or the county. You don't have to go to the police department. We can deal with the mayor and we can get this done.
All right, thank you for that. I want to go into a place before we start closing up, but I want to talk about the weeds, like when you're on the ground, you're in the trenches, versus when you have an aerial view. You know, Mr. Williams, there was a difference between before you were a police officer and the things that you saw and what could be gambled versus once you became a police officer, your knowledge base has expanded and now you are accountable for the things that you know. So what happens quite often is people agitate from the outside, they get access and enter on the inside, and then their mindset changes because their view changes. And then people think they've been selling out. They think that, you know, but the truth is there are some different viewpoints. So how do we continue to agitate without, so that we can get the change that we need without losing sight of what, when our eyes are open? How do we begin to balance those issues? Because and to be very clear, it's one thing to say, I'm ready to fight. It's and do whatever and go down when you're single, when you're uneducated, when you don't have a job, when you have nothing to lose, versus when you have a spouse, when you have children, when you have parents who are sick and you're taking care of them, to say, well, I'll lose my job and not care about that. There's that balance. Well, I don't know if there's a balance because I'm not one who really lives that way, but I do know quite often people think that it's a balancing act of maintaining their integrity, maintaining their job, their status in their job, I mean, in their churches, their communities. How do we begin to tackle that? Because now that we have more to lose, people are less willing to take a chance to make change.
Well, I think the Black Lives Matter movement now is a chance for us to make great inroads. I admire those young people, I really do. And they have the ears and the hearts of the people. There's a great movement going on. I say get as much as you can from it. Reach for the sky. You might get to the rooftop. Yeah. But we have to get as much as we can out of this, because I think somewhere down the line, there's a backlash and the pendulum starts swinging the other way, you know?
Yeah, yeah.
So I say, let's keep this going as long as we possibly can. It is great and necessary.
Yeah.
It is great. It's necessary. Go ahead, Ms. Worley.
I'd just like to add to that. When I was telling my husband about all of this racism and discrimination within the FBI ranks, he said, well, how would you recruit? Why would you recruit Blacks to go into that organization knowing it's so discriminatory? I said, because we need to get in to make those changes, to try to root out some of the racism. If we're not there to let them run rampant, you know, with racist things, then we're not doing America any justice. We have to be in to make the changes.
Good point.
I agree with that. I found out that after I joined the police department that there was so much racism in the police department, which was surprising me at the beginning. But then I realized that it was there and it was going to be there, and it's deep bedded. It's deep bedded. It's going to be hard to get some of those people out of there. And I say, the more they ask for, get what you can from it. I'm serious.
All right, so what I'm going to do is we received criminal justice reform suggestions by some of the registrants of this platform. And as I go through each one of them, I want you all to think about what a person has to be willing to lose. Because my daddy told me a long time ago, you are a completely different person and have a completely different strategy when you're willing to lose. You are going to win when you're willing to lose, and it changes everything. So many times we talk about change, but are we willing to lose in order to gain? So as I go through these, I want you to think about ones that people who are going to be pushing these, what they may be having to lose. The number one is defunding the police and giving money to community programs. Another one is a national database to track police who have been discharged for bad conduct. We also have requiring every police officer to take out practice insurance policies to cover any type of misconduct, and that would handle the issues related to qualified immunity. Federalize the police so that they operate under national standards and rules. Also eliminate the stronghold of police officer unions. We all know that that's a very powerful union, I'll just say. That coming from a person who believes in unions and understands that the whole police union thing, I don't know what you're protecting the people when your job is to serve the people, they're your boss. So that's a whole nother dynamic, but I'll leave that, please. Remove the blue wall of silence in police departments. Another is community training for all police officers. Next is citizen review boards that have absolute powers. That's from Mr. Davis. Hey, Mr. Davis. Vetting and more voter information on judges running for office. And for those of you who don't know, very difficult to get information on judges. If you've ever been to a forum with judges running for office, their answers are, I can't really answer that. I can't tell how I would handle a case. And that makes it extremely difficult to get to know them or identify that character we were talking about. Next is alternatives to arrest and incarceration for minor or nonviolent crimes. Also install whistleblower programs to encourage policemen to report misconduct to coworkers. So it's one thing to say that you're not going to penalize it. It's another thing to say that you're going to reward it, because people tend to go towards the reward. Next is eliminating no-knock laws, eliminating mandatory lengthy sentences for nonviolent drug offenders, and stricter body camera policies with severe penalties if not followed. So I'm going to ask you guys, which is the final question, what is the role of New Covenant in criminal justice reform? So if New Covenant is willing to take chances, willing to lose something, and to implement any of these reforms, I'm going to give each of you 30 seconds, and we'll wrap up in a couple minutes. 30 seconds, I promise y'all, 30 seconds. If you can discuss any of the reform and let us know as a New Covenant what that looks like and what we have to be willing to lose in order to make it happen. Starting with you, Mr. Burnett.
Okay, well, New Covenant has always been aggressive in terms of empowering Black people. We've had people come to the churches running for office and let them speak. And we've had voter registration drives and taking people to the poll. Reverend Rose has been great about that. We've had seminars, and recently we had the COVID testing at our church. And so we do a lot of things. And I think that if we can, I like to just start on the policies that we can change. Simply as going and requiring more Black officers, requiring more transparency from the police, requiring more tougher body camera policy so the policemen cannot turn these things off unless they will be penalized. I think New Covenant is willing to do some of those things without, I know Reverend Rose has to listen to his congregation, but awesome. I think he listened to God too, though. And so God is on our side.
Amen to that. Thank you. Next, Mr. Williams, what do you think can be done in the reforms that I just listed? What do we have to be willing to lose in order to make it happen?
I think the first one you said, defund maybe the police. I think when you pull on that purse string, it gets their attention. They are thinking now that they're going to lose them. And I think the only way to break that strong union is to defund some of that money. That money makes them think, money makes them change, money makes them gets their ear. It gets their attention. I don't say you have to take all the money from them and no police and all that. That's crazy. But I think you need to put them on some kind of system. It's a reward system. If they don't perform better, they don't get no raise. The union understand that, and the union is very strong, and you're not going to move that union until you do something like that.
All right, so you're talking about defunding, but not ending, because that's crazy, and I appreciate that response. All right, Ms. Worley, what is it that you think that we need to be willing to lose in order to make any of these reforms come to pass?
I don't look at it as losing, but I look at it as we should be trying to do more of a partnership with the police and the community. New Covenant could maybe even host some type of a social event. Invite the police, invite the community, and just be human. Because if you're taking care of a community as a police officer, you need to have a relationship with the people, because those are the people you're protecting. And if you see them in a different light, a social light environment, then there's a more of a connection there.
Understood. Thank you for that. And just to be very clear, when I say willing to lose, I'm talking about people have to be, are you willing to lose your job over this? Or are we going to continue to lose our humanity over this? Are you willing to lose your housing? Are you willing to lose relationships? Are you willing to lose your pretty reputation or your status in your job to go in and to make it happen? Moving to you, Mr. Wilson, what do you think that we need to do in order to make certain that some of these reforms come to pass? 30 seconds.
As you were saying, we must be willing to lose. You know, I was thinking, as Ms. Worley was talking, that's the kind of idea I was thinking, that we could be like a place where we can generate conversation between the officers and the community. We can have people in that where we can talk about different ways to go about making these changes, what needs to be changes, how we could do it. And giving of our time, giving of ourselves, and being willing to be invested and make this thing happen.
I love it. You were at 29 seconds. Kudos to you. All right. So I'm going to move over to you, Mr. Anderson, to let us know, you know, a lot of times we get comfortable, right? And it is our comforts that we're giving up, that we're letting go of. So what do we have to do in order to make this happen, these reforms?
You're talking to me.
Yes, sir.
Oh,
Dr.
okay.
Anderson. Dr. Anderson, I'm sorry.
That's okay. I wasn't sure. Yeah, we'd have to be willing to listen to the community, do community asset assessment, see what's already out there and how we can use that to move things forward. Also be willing to redesign what's going on. Police officers do not have to show up at every incident. Sanford is already pushing the relationship community policing, which is working much better, getting to know people, just as our colleague just said, foot officers, you get to know the people. In the cars, you don't. Another city in Oregon is now sending out mental health workers along with maybe paramedics to address someone who seems they're intoxicated. So you don't have police officers having to address that issue. And you won't end up with a shooting if somebody doesn't have a gun, because they're there to listen and try to de-escalate.
Awesome. Awesome.
And
De-escalation.
we have to be willing to lose members who don't go along with it.
I know that's right. Thank you for that. And close it out for us, Ms. Davis.
I wanted to piggyback on everything everybody said, but I wanted to focus more on the comfort zone, what you're willing to lose, because what we also have to realize, whether we're talking no knocks, you know, because for you that maybe they can catch somebody that killed your daughter or possessed something, so that, you know, you have to be willing to give that comfort, as well as the other, you know, things like your 10th Amendment rights. If we talk about nationalizing the police, right? Because the states have policing power. So we have to be ready to give up those things that we know that under the Constitution, we have these rights, you know, in the states have the policing power. Once we start making things more nationally, we're going to lose a lot of those protections, and it's going to be under one big government. And when this whole thing was written, while it probably wasn't written for us to begin with, you know, there's still going to be protections that we are going to lose surrounding that.
It wasn't written for us, but now that we're free, we will use it for us, right? I really was timing, y'all. All right, so at this point, I want to thank you all for your participation and the lively discussion that hopefully at least gets us thinking in a different manner, because the worst thing that we can do is just continue to talk without broadening our ideas and at least hardening something that makes us intolerant to the continued inhumane treatment and the injustice that the community is serving. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Mr. Terry.
Okay, well, thank you for such an excellent job for you, the panelists, and our moderator. Appreciate it very much. So the goal and objective that I wanted to get from this was really to encourage the participants, those of you that are online via YouTube, get involved in their communities. You know, support public issues. You know, candidates with relevant platforms that address some of the issues that we talked about earlier in the symposium, and make your voices heard. Vote. You know, we have to vote in local, we have to vote in the state, and we have to vote in the federal. And I think before I move on to my final closing comments, I'm going to turn it over to Beverly Neal, because I think it's very important, the social justice and what the NAACP is doing, and some of their committees and their agenda ties back to that statement that addresses my goals and objectives.
Thank you, Michael. And I think that we had one of the greatest panels that we've ever had at New Covenant. And like you said, this should be a beginning. And because we've got so much to do, we don't realize, and I've been saying this over and over, our lives depend on how we vote. It's not a matter of if I vote, I'm not sure I'm going to vote. No, we must vote. And not only do we have to vote, we've got to make sure that we take people with us to vote. The other thing that we've got to do is we have got to educate people. You know, a coach don't put players out on the team to play unless they know the rules of the game. We don't know the rules, but we want to play the game. And I've listened to all of the comments that everyone has made, but you got to know how to put it together in order to make it happen. You know, people say they want a seat at the table. I've seen a lot of people sitting at the table, but they're not doing anything. They're not doing anything for their communities. We've got some very serious elections that are coming up in during the primary, and we're going to be doing as much information and education about what you need to look for in these candidates. I'm just saying we are beyond the days where my friend is running, and I'm going to vote for them, and they're not qualified. You know, we got to look at the records. I'm listening to these candidates out there. They talk about what they're going to do and how they're going to do. We got to look at what have you done when you had the opportunity to do it. And it's not about who telling me to vote. We're going to have to do the research. We're going to help you do the research through the NAACP. We're putting together a voters production. We're going to tell you what the issues are. We're going to tell you what government agency handles it, and we're going to tell you who the elected officials are that will vote on your issues. These are the things you need to know before you go in and pull any lever. I know that the vote by mail ballots have already been sent out, and I just can't leave without saying this. Please, please, if you are going to vote by mail, please make sure you know what you're doing. Because once that ballot leaves your hands, you have no control over whether it's going to be counted. And I know vote by mail seems like a very easy way to vote. It is if you know how to vote, if you know what you're doing. And I have been at the canvassing boards, and I've seen too many ballots that have been discarded because people don't know how to handle those ballots. You may make a mistake on that ballot. You may use the wrong color ink. Where it has to be circles, you may put an X. All of that will cause your ballot to not be counted. So
come on, Miss Beverly.
So I'm just saying, you know, let's know the rules before we try to play the game.
Yeah.
And if we do that, then I'm sure New Covenant will be a 100% voting church. And that's what I'm hoping we will have. But I'm going to be sending out, I told Pastor, we're going to be doing information after next Sunday. So be on the lookout for little tidbits with educational tips about voting, how you need to vote and why you need to vote. And I think that when we do that, we won't have to worry about the table, because we're going to have people at the table who we know are going to be there for the people. You know what I mean? They're not going to be there just to be at the table. So when the pie come by, they don't know how to take a slice of it, okay? So we got to do what we got to do, and we got to do it right. And with that, I'm just going to say thank you, Aramis. I really, really appreciate you.
Love you.
All right. So let's see. A couple of housekeeping notes. Each of the participants in the that's online today, you will be receiving a survey, and we do ask that you respond and provide feedback and any recommendations. Got plenty of recommendations and suggestions for reforms, but obviously due to the lack of time, we couldn't get into all of them. But we know a lot has to be done, but I pray that today's symposium was the start. I'm saying it was just a start, and realizing that more has to be done. Some of the topics addressed today also require, as we just mentioned, local, state, and federal legislative changes. So I want to leave you with this quote that I saw in an email today, and it read, "Power of the ballot, we need pure defense. Else, what shall save us from a second slavery? Power of the ballot, we need in sheer defense. Else, what shall save us from a second slavery?" W.E.B. All right. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Pastor for comments and final closing. And again, thank you, panelists. And again, I'm going to thank my cousin, Aramis, for, I'm adopting her too.
I'll take it.
All right. But again, thank each of you, and we appreciate it. And again, thank you, Pastor, for allowing us to use this as a forum.
Amen. Thank you, Brother Terry, for hosting this in the men's ministry. I'm appreciative to you and to our 6 panelists. We thank God for each of you for your insight and your passion with which you presented today. And I'm believing that this is the beginning of more discussion, and discussion that will lead to deliberate action. And so I'm thankful for that. Sister Beverly Neal, the leader of our social justice ministry at the church, I am thankful for you for being on this today. And of course, to our own beloved state attorney, Aramis Ayala. She's Sister Neal's niece and Michael Terry's cousin. So I guess she's my sister. And
I'll take that too, Pastor Rose.
And she's always been kind to the Rose family and to the New Covenant Church. And I'm absolutely thankful for the spirit in which she leads and carries herself. It is understandably the spirit of the Lord, and we're thankful for that. So listen,
thank you, sir.
God bless you, and thank you. Let me leave you with this. I won't hold you because we've had a great panel discussion today. This will be posted on YouTube in just a short time. But the word of the Lord says, as we close tonight, he has shown us, oh man, what is good and what the Lord requires of us. It is simply to act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with our God. God's going to empower us to do what's necessary in order to allow his glory to be presented on this earth, justice to be presented on this earth. And I thank God for all the willing vessels that join us via Zoom on the panel and via YouTube. And may the Lord bless all of us as we do our part to make sure that the will of the Lord is done on earth. I'm going to say goodnight to you all. God bless you. And for those of you who will be joining me at 8:30 on the prayer call, I'll see you there. All right. Good night.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.
All right.